Bonjour à tous et à toutes, et bienvenue dans ce séminaire qui se déroule dans le cadre du projet Internationalisation at Home de l'Université Rennes 2, où je suis enseignant-chercheur au sein du département de portugais et de l'équipe de recherche ERIMIT. Projet donc qui propose aux étudiants et étudiantes et aux collègues de cette université et de notre partenaire, l'Université fédérale Fluminense, une série de séminaires dont la thématique est la littérature brésilienne en perspective, dialogue avec les traditions littéraires caribéennes, nord-américaines et sud-américaines. L'objectif de ce séminaire, de ces rencontres, est de proposer une réflexion autour du dialogue et de l'articulation existant entre la littérature brésilienne contemporaine et les littératures caribéennes, nord-américaines et la littérature brésilienne contemporaine et sud-américaine. Pour la première rencontre de cette année universitaire, nous recevons le collègue José Luiz Jobim, qui est professeur titulaire à l'Université fédérale Fluminense, ex-président de l'Association brésilienne de littérature comparée et chercheur au CNPq et à la FAPERJ. Il est l'auteur de l'ouvrage paru récemment, en 2024, Littérature comparée et littérature nationale, circulation et représentation, et a organisé les ouvrages Novas Palavras da Crítica en 3 volumes parus en 2021, 2023 et 2024. Parmi ces publications les plus récentes également, dans des revues et des livres, on compte Le comparatisme et le climat au XIXe siècle, Ferdinand Denis entre les Amériques et l'Afrique, paru en 2024, North-South Comparatism, New Worldism, Theories of Lax and Acclimatization, en 2022, The Geopolitics of Comparing and Representing the Other, paru en 2021, Literatura comparada e literatura brasileira, paru en 2020. Jobim a été professeur invité à l'Universidad de la República, en Uruguay, et professeur de la chaire des Amériques, ici même à l'Université Rennes 2, avec l'Institut des Amériques. Également à l'Université de l'Illinois, aux États-Unis. Il est membre du Board of Advisors and Seminar Leader at Institute for World Literature de Harvard. Il est chercheur du projet Print UFI, qui est le projet d'internationalisation. Le séminaire que Jobim présente aujourd'hui s'intitule What is at stake when we compare literatures and cultures from different countries and regions, et propose de présenter brièvement la façon dont le regard colonial a généré des théories du manque, de penser les façons de voir la circulation littéraire et culturelle qui sont en corrélation les unes avec les autres et avec les hypothèses colonialistes, et enfin de comprendre comment un certain nationalisme du XIXe siècle, d'où sont issus certains internationalismes, apparaît comme un arrière-plan dans les études comparatives, générant des effets sur la représentation littéraire des Amérindiens. Je vais donc laisser la parole à Jobim et je te remercie vivement pour ta présence encore une fois et ta collaboration dans ce projet international qu'on mène déjà depuis 3 ans ensemble, pour mon plus grand plaisir. Merci Jobim, on te laisse la parole, on t'écoute.
Merci, Mireille. I would like to start by thanking Professor Garcia for the invitation to be here. It's always a pleasure to be with her and with the students of the Master des Amériques, where I was before teaching at the Chaire des Amériques in 2022. And now I return. This sounds like a sequel if we're talking about American movies. But let me start by telling you that if you want to read more about the subjects I will talk about here, I will have a recommendation of 3 titles. And please, Mireille, slide number 2. This is the first one, the second. Yeah, 3 important books. The first one is by David Damrosch, Comparing the Literatures, Literary Studies in a Global Age, Princeton University Press, 2020. The second one is by Jean-Marc Murat, La totalité littéraire, théorie et enjeux de la littérature mondiale. It was published by Presse Universitaire de France, 2020. 23. And the third one, Mireille has already mentioned, is my littérature comparée, littérature nationale, circulation et représentation, which is available in open access, free access, in this address here. And this is the first thing I would like to tell you. But now let me just start my talk here. In comparative studies, many scholars think that the principle of judging the other, the distant, the foreign, using as a term of comparison what is already known, the familiar, the close, is something more general, as does Feng Xia. Slide 4, please. Feng Xia says, I will quote him, "The connection between comparison and the formation of the mature consciousness of a social being lies in the fact that comparison is an activity that consciousness undertakes when it encounters something foreign or other to itself." End of quote. However, as I live in a geopolitically located place in the so-called global South, strongly marked by colonialism, I always wonder if the unrestricted adoption of this principle as valid would not simply imply a way of knowing that can only perceive what the colonial gaze has already seen. From my point of view, I consider that there is always already a more or less established set of meanings in which comparative is rooted, whose historicity, scope, and limits are not always clear, but which remains in force, circulating and producing effects. In fact, one of the most important contributions of comparativism has been precisely thinking about this circulation and these effects, and somehow trying to make explicit the assumptions that are implicit when we think about them. Slide 5, please, Roberto. Here I intend to briefly show how the colonial gaze generated theories of lack, how ways of seeing literary and cultural circulation correlated with each other and with literary assumptions, and finally, how a certain 19th century nationalism, from which some internationalism stemmed, appears as a background in comparative studies, generating effects on the literary representations of Amerindians. With regard to the Americas in general and to Brazil in particular, since the arrival of Columbus and Pedro Álvares Cabral, the inclusion of the New World, entre guillemets, on the European horizon implied at the same time the emergence of a certain comparatism through which the new was judged based on what was already known. In other words, when comparing the old world with the new world, the former was used as a parameter to judge the latter. It is no wonder, therefore, that this type of attitude has generated a kind of comparativism often based on theories of lack. As I have argued previously, you can see the argument in my book, theories of lack are derived from the production of European meanings about the dominions incorporated via the process of colonization. Since they were initially formulated, they have been widely disseminated in countries with European colonial heritage, like Brazil. They imply the production of knowledge that, focused on these dominions and claiming to explain the true facts about this new reality, in fact, created representations of the dominated territories and peoples based on perspectives rooted in the old world. Therefore, via a comparative perspective in which the evaluation criterion used in the comparison was basically European. Judgments were formed about the New World, in which Europe was used as an instrument to evaluate or measure what was found here in the so-called New World. If something considered relevant in the Old World was not found in the New World, this absence was considered a lack. Thus, writers, critics, and comparatists had and still have to deal with this vision of lack, either adopting it or opposing it. For this reason, we will begin by presenting in post-independence texts from the 19th century how the meanings of this lack are constructed, so that we understand what is at stake when the comparison is based on theories of lack from that century on in South America or Brazil. The 19th century is also known as the century of nationalism, in which frames of reference for national literatures were created both in Europe and South America. With regard to historical representations of the literary past, traditionally structured with nationalist criteria, the criterion of local color was also used as a factor for inclusion or exclusion of works and authors. Of course, it is well known that the issue of nationalism in itself is complex, but I will argue here that ideas about internationalisms also stem from a certain nationalism, historically circumscribed. In fact, the various types of internationalism had many faces after the 19th century and received more than one name: cosmopolitanism, globalization, mondialization, etc. But they maintain a general logic of following the so-called law of the strongest. In this case, that of the strongest nation states, all located in the so-called global north, and all very much concerned about their own national geopolitical interests. However, even if we focus our attention only on the great colonialist powers, Susan Besant has already claimed that there was a cultural and literary rivalry between equals, a horizontal axis between European powers, horizontal because it was only possible to imagine that the comparison was between equals. If, on the one hand, in the European context, it has been a problem since at least the 19th century to restrict comparatism to the equals, France, the UK, Germany, and to a lesser extent, Spain and Italy. On the other hand, in former colonies, the colonialist logic that underpinned this kind of equality became another problem. The adoption of this logic can be illustrated in Tobias Barreto's pioneering work Traços de Literatura Comparada do século XIX, Outline of Comparative Literature in the 19th Century, written in 1877. As a ground for comparativism, this Brazilian author believed in a European-based universalism to be conveyed in the literature of the 19th century, and he also thought that the study of foreign languages and literatures was a characteristic feature of his time. Barreto argued that, as a consequence of the exchange of ideas, the cultured nations made a part of Europe, the equals, and a good portion of the Americas unique. However, for him, these prominently unique peoples were hierarchically constituted, and the few languages and literatures that mattered to him did not include the Portuguese. Barreto excluded even his own country's literature from his book, Arguing. Slide 6, please. In the present century, only 4 nations, Germany, France, England, and Italy, have been at the head of the literary movement, and only their literatures deserve the title of Weltliteraturen, as the Germans say, or universal literatures. Everything that is good, useful, and has been thought, written, and spoken in any other place, in this or that epigone country, has always been a repercussion of the original thinking of the 4 main countries. End of quote. Internationalism, in the case of the former colonies, also meant the use by old and new colonial powers of a gaze that judged with the colonial scale of values, presented as universal. Everything that those powers found in invaded and subdued countries. In these territories, local literatures and cultures, because they were judged on that scale, began to incorporate the meanings that those colonialist theories or ideas gave them. Consequently, the affinities, analogies, similarities, or the differences, contrasts, the similarities pointed out in them, paid tribute to those theories or ideas which became an integral part of the historical meanings of the comparisons. As these colonialist ideas were also presented as a basis for thinking about the reality of colonized territories, they survived long after the end of the occupation colonialism. Slide 7, please. Today, we can see more clearly that in any comparison between 2 literary and cultural elements, there's already a construction of meaning, which can be related to a specific historical social context. If we choose 2 or more elements as comparable, 2 works, 2 authors, 2 themes, they are no longer considered in their supposed individualities. In fact, whether consciously or unconsciously, comparisons are made based on ideas. By ideas, I mean tacitly acquired notions, ways of thinking rooted in common sense, prejudice, etc. Or theories. By theories, I mean systematized construction or knowledge, whose constitutive parts are already invested with the meanings that are given to them in advance. Consequently, the affinities, analogies, similarities or differences, contrasts, the similarities pointed out in the comparisons paid tribute to those theories or ideas which become an integral part of their historical meanings. In the Brazilian case, we will show in a synthetic way how some proposals for inclusion or exclusion are configured based on a kind of nationalism associated with local color, even though the first Brazilian work of comparative literature, Tobias Barreto's 1877 book, adopted the perspective of the subaltern who accepts and confirms his subaltern condition without taking into consideration Brazilian local color. 19th century nationalism, when used as a basis for the internationalism that founded the beginning of comparative literature, is still a problem today for many reasons. Among other things, it creates difficulties for the literary and cultural incorporation of Americans whenever they contest the very logic of nation states that often also served international comparativism. As internationality both implies the existence of ideas and theories about literary and cultural circulation between nations and pays tribute to nationalism, we will present some few examples of the Brazilian contribution to the discussion of this issue, showing how it was precursor in many ways. We will then begin our brief journey by illustrating how theories of lack have been articulating meanings of subalternity that serve as a basis for the construction of comparables. Slide 8, please. Imagine a European who, on arriving in South America in the 17th century, realized that there were no peaches here, but there were jabuticaba berries. Jabuticaba berries only exist in Brazil, as far as I know. Departing from the principle that the version of the world to be followed is the European one, we might say that peaches are lacking here. Or, of course, he could say that there is a difference between the world of European fruit and that of South America, one that is marked by the absence or presence of different fruits on the two continents. The difference would not mean that one object, a peach, was worth more than the other, the jabuticaba, nor that the absence of one signified a lack or deficiency. Ferdinand Denis, the French writer who served as maître à penser for Brazilian writers in the 19th century, in his Scènes de la nature sur les tropiques et de leur influence sur la poésie, gave the example of an old European who always compared the fruits and flavors of the Americas with those of his native land, giving them a meaning derived from or associated with the experiences he had in his country of origin, always judging the fruits of the Americas against their European counterparts. Therefore, when fruits are seen as comparable, there are previous meanings that will emerge as substrata, traces of a past that will connect with the affinities, analogies, similarities, differences, or contrasts within the comparison to be made. Slide 9, please. The Brazilian novelist José de Alencar, in his preface to Sonhos de Ouro, 1872, Dreams of Gold, also uses a fruit to discuss post-colonial comparison. What does he say? The mango, the first time it is tasted, is thought to have the strange taste of turpentine. Once you are used to it, you delight in the delicious taste. The same is true of the few truly Brazilian books. The Portuguese palate detects in them an aftertaste. But if they live here with us, in the same climate, attracted by the customs of their sister family in motherland, they soon gently resonate. Slide 10, please. Brazilian literature in the post-colonial context is frequently seen as a case of universalization of particular language, Portuguese, giving rise to at least two situations. One, in the 19th century, the demand predominates that the former colony writers follow the Portuguese models of written language use. And two, from the late 20th century, Brazilian difference is widely presented as a specific case of transnational lusophony. In the first case, difference in Brazilian usage is marked as a lack of correction in relation to standard Portuguese. In the second, the starting point is a linguistic community that is imagined in order to produce post-colonial connections and effects. Slide 11, please. José de Alencar ends his preface to Dreams of Gold by again using fruit to suggest that even when we talk about equivalence between peoples who speak the same language, there is always a difference. And I quote, "Can the people who suck cashew fruit, mangoes, cambucá, and jabuticaba fruit speak a language with the same pronunciation and the same spirit as the people who suck figs, pears, apricots, and loquats?" End of quote. In a way, the situations exemplified above compare to some extent differences and similarities between former metropolises and former colonies. In South America today, new forms of comparativism have emerged that reject considering difference as a lack or deficiency, but it is also possible to see the continued existence as a significant cultural substratum of traces of the colonial past. One of the characteristics of Brazilian and South American literary critics since the 19th century has been to provide an evaluation of local authors by comparing them with others which are not local, particularly Europeans. Not all authors have been bothered by this because it has been a very widespread practice, but the exceptions are very significant and constitute a kind of tradition of resistance to this kind of evaluation. Let's see slide 12, please. In the same preface to Sonhos de Ouro, Dreams of Gold, Alencar addressed the critics. So, illustrious and non-illustrious representatives of criticism, do not restrict yourselves. Criticize, nitpick, or hold your peace as you see fit. You will never manage to make me here in my Brazil right. You will never manage to make me here in my Brazil write something that appears to have arrived preserved from the other side of the world like tinned fruit. I will go back to this tinned fruit. Slide 13. Decades later, picking up from Alencar's rejections of things that appear to have arrived preserved in a can, Oswald de Andrade would, in his Cannibalist Manifesto, speak out against all the importance of tinned consciousness. So you had tinned fruit, now tinned consciousness. The idea of importing ideas, but keeping their original meaning, tinned consciousness, is criticized in that manifesto, which was also interpreted as a thesis about what should happen in literary and cultural circulation. The foreign idea should be swallowed and processed in the national stomach to be transformed into something else. Regarding comparativism, there are other interesting contributions to what is at stake in literary and cultural circulation, different from the method of permanently searching for sources and influences widely used in French comparative literature. This method was criticized by authors such as Silviano Santiago because it restricted itself to mistakenly emphasizing a supposed lack of imagination on the part of artists who would be forced, due to a lack of native tradition, to appropriate models put into circulation throughout the metropolis. Literary and cultural circulation, if seen from the ex-colony, would be another thing. Slide 19, please. The definition of circulation stems from apparently simple questions. How does a given literary or cultural element with an alleged origin in a certain place insert itself in another place? What is at stake when a given literary or cultural element moves from one place to another? In a not so distant past, it was believed that the greater or lesser circulation of a work was due to attributes that characterized it as more universal or more local. The supposed universality of certain works, the absolute majority of which were European, was said to be purely the result of their inherent qualities, which allowed them to circulate beyond their place of origin in different spaces and times. Slide 20, slide 20, por favor. Circulation even became a value in itself, one that determined which works composed the corpus in a field known in the English-speaking world as world literature. This was based on a proposition made by David Damrosch that all literary works that circulate beyond their place of origin, whether in their original language or in translation, be included in the category of world literature. As we know, Karl Marx and Marxist writers made a major contribution to the field, emphasizing the fact that texts, when they circulate from their original places to others, lose their context. Nevertheless, this type of contribution draws greater attention to the meaning rooted in the alleged origin of the text. New meanings attributed in new places are then seen either as deviations from or as alterations of a supposed original meaning. Another type of focus is one that emphasizes what happens in the place to which the text migrated. The second type argues, for example, that the circulation of elements of European literature in other continents does not mean that they will have in these other places the same meaning they had in their place of origin. Through this focus, the reasons why these European elements, and not others, were embraced must be sought not in the place of origin, but in the place that embraced them. It was the interests and needs of the importers that explained certain elements being internalized and others being rejected. Moreover, the imported elements take on new meanings when incorporated into new context, where they correlate with different elements to those present in their place of origin. It is for this reason that in 1954, Roger Bastide proposed that the problem of comparative literature be positioned in the terrain of social globality. I quote Roger Bastide. Only then will the reasons for choices, the transformation of foreign fashions, the channels of passage, and the processes of metamorphosis be really clarified. However, since the circulation of a work beyond its place of origin does not only depend on its supposed inherent value, allegedly recognized in the other places where it has circulated, but also on a series of other factors, using circulation as a criterion to include this work in or exclude it from a literary canon is at best questionable. Slide 21, por favor. When the work moves from one place, not necessarily its place of origin, to another, as I have previously highlighted, there is a series of factors to take into consideration. The importance or not of the subject matter of the work for the new places where it inserts itself, the dominant interests in the place where the work is reappropriated, according to which it may be considered relevant or not, the obstacle or provisions from the comparative cultural analysis of literary and cultural systems with their respective hierarchies and practices, and so on. Slide 22, por favor. In some way, the suggestion that works that circulate more are worth more relates to preconceived ideas that there are universal works and local ones, failing to consider the historical context in which these very attributions of meaning occur. This entails overlooking a series of historical facts that explain why certain local works were universalized and why, in a transnational system in which there are embedded hegemonies and hierarchies, better conditions for circulations were created for certain works and not for others. This also means forgetting the conditions in which works were created and the resulting naturalization of a canon that was compiled at the given moment in a specific historically and geopolitically located society. Literary and cultural circulation does not respect territorial borders. To understand the configuration of meanings in a given national literature, it is necessary to understand the relations between these meanings and others located in other places and times. It is necessary to understand if, when, why, and how meanings from outside circulate within, and what happens when they do so, or those from within circulate beyond the extreme limits of a place moving outside. When he presided over the jury of the Casa de las Américas prize, for which I was a jury member in 2008, the Cuban poet and essayist Roberto Fernandez Retamar summarized for me as follows his opinion on the fact that there are not many Latin American authors in the canon of those considered universal. The problem, in his view, was not the lack of high quality authors, but the lack of wider circulation of their works. For this reason, it has been and continues to be important for authors and critics from the global south to consider what is at play in literary and cultural circulation. Slide 23, por favor. Within the major Marxist contribution to the theorization of literary and cultural circulation, one of the most cited texts is by Roberto Schwartz, Ideias Fora do Lugar, Misplaced Ideas in English, originally published in 1977, although it should be stressed that this was not the main topic or the only one dealt by the author. They are in this book. In this essay that studies the importation of liberal ideas into Brazil, Schwartz provides an important reflection on what happens when ideas leave one place and travel to another. In his view, it is against the common backdrop of an international capitalist system that ideas circulate, but they had different meanings in their place of origin and in the places to which they migrate. Slide 24, por favor. As we know, in the Communist Manifesto 1848, Marx and Engels wrote that the socialist and communist literature of France, which they argued emerged under the pressure of a dominant bourgeoisie and was the literary expression of the struggle against this domination, was introduced in Germany at a time when the bourgeoisie was beginning its struggle against feudal absolutism. The circulation of this literature to Germany without its original context, they argued, transformed it into something else. I quote Marx and Engels. German philosophers, would-be philosophers, and beaux esprits, men of letters, eagerly seized on this literature, only forgetting that when these writings immigrated from France into Germany, French social conditions had not immigrated along with them. In contact with German social conditions, this French literature lost all its immediate practical significance and assumed a purely literary aspect. End of quote. Schwartz argues that liberal ideas circulated to Brazil without their original context, transforming into something else based on an appropriation that, within the local conditions of the 19th century, made it possible, for example, to adopt the most advanced ideas on the planet and at the same time to be a slave-holding society, because those ideas did not serve the same purpose as they did in their original context. Slide 25, por favor. In the opinion of Schwartz, European ideas imported by an elite linked to the international capitalist system to large exporting agricultural states could be ornamental when presented as a sign that this elite was up to date with the most modern aspects of Europe. In Brazil, these ideas did not lead to the practical consequences in the real lives of the population that were intended in their original context. There was, Schwartz argues, therefore, a mismatch between the original meanings of these ideas in Europe, linked with their organic relationships with reality there, and their immigration to Brazil, where the same relationship did not exist. Thus, within the transnational capitalist system, social groups that, on a national level, were privileged members of this system could verbalize positions that would not be verbalized by analogous groups in Europe, including in the realm of culture and literature. Slide 26, por favor. Pierre Bourdieu, perhaps the most famous Marxist thinker of his age in France, in a text published over a decade after Schwartz, maintained that the attribution of value to the context of origin, but added that the context of the reception of the work in another place should have equal importance. I quote, "The meaning and function of a foreign work are determined at least both by the field of reception and by the field of origin." End of quote. In Bourdieu's view, when work moves from one place to another, it loses a degree of its original meaning for various reasons, such as the lack of knowledge in the place of reception of its meaning and function in the original place, and the application to the work of categories of perception and problematics that belong to the place where the work is received and not to the place of origin. Silviano Santiago, in an essay originally written in 1971, made comments on the ways of seeing the Latin American writers as imitating or appropriating a foreign model. Although he considered that the critics' search for sources and influences on these writers' work was a deeply embedded habit in the universities, he also claimed for another way of seeing their work. For Santiago, even when those writers had a connection with a European work, they resignified it, transforming it into another thing. Thus, it made no sense either to attribute a supposed lack of imagination to them or to consider their work to being parasitic, supposing they fed on the prestige and brilliance inherent in the source without contributing anything of their own. According to Santiago, the Latin American text is secondary in the sense that it represents a silent, treacherous meditation on the primary text. When the reader of that primary text becomes a writer, he or she becomes proactive. I quote Silviano Santiago. He or she tries to expose the original model and its limitations, in its weaknesses, in its gaps, to disarticulate and rearticulate it in accordance with their intentions, depending on his or her own ideological orientation and vision of the subject matter presented initially by the original. End of quote. If Silviano Santiago, a former president of the Brazilian Comparative Literature Association, was a pioneer in criticizing a certain type of comparativism that, taking the category of influence as a fundamental one, focused on the dissemination of European literature beyond its place of origin, he was also instrumental in drawing attention to the fact that there are no impermeable literary traditions completely dissociated from all others. Slide 27, por favor. In fact, Like other Latin American writers, Santiago sees his work both as a literary author and critic as stemming from a certain tradition, but not repeating it. I quote him: "Our critical work will be defined above all by the analysis of the use that the writer has made of a text or of a literary technique that belongs to everybody, of the benefit he draws from it. And our analysis will be completed by the description of the technique that the same writer creates in his aggressive tackling of the original model, breaking down the foundations that presented it as a unique object that was impossible to reproduce. The imaginary in the context of new colonialism can no longer be that of ignorance or ingenuousness, fed by simplistic manipulation of the information gleaned from the author's immediate experience, but increasingly asserts itself as writing on another writing." End of quotation. Slide 28, por favor. In this sense, Santiago's position differs from that of the Caribbean writer Edouard Glissant, who imagined Caribbean writers as lacking the centuries-long literary continuity that the French had. That's Edouard Glissant's opinion. Slide 29. Although I recognize that there are important points to consider within Glissant's line of argument, I believe that when an author produces a work, he or she is always confronted by an entire tradition into which his work inserts itself. In other words, Caribbean writers in relation to French literature and other Francophone literatures, like the Brazilians in relation to Portuguese literature and to other Lusophone literatures, will always be confronted with a given inheritance of meanings based on which, against which, and with which they will produce their own works in the place they find themselves. But the place where they are will make a difference. Slide 30, por favor. And now I'll try to define what is a place. A place is, above all, a construction created by several human generations who lived there or who passed through, and who helped to formulate the meaning it has at each moment in history. It is constituted by public networks of meaning that shape subjectivity. In it, symbolically mediated public interpretations are formed, including about the meaning of this place and about what it means to be inserted here. In a given place, elements circulate that somehow impose meaning on the singular experiences of individuals. Elements in relation to which these individuals interpret their own experiences and the text they read, as well as direct their actions. In other words, the place is always a source of preconceptions that in some way contribute to the creation of our discourse, since in it is located our discourse's system of references, including the universe of themes, interests, conceptual terms, and so on. A system that always establishes from the outset limits within which our field of enunciation is circumscribed. Places always have a history, and even the wiping out of certain elements that make up the history of a place is also due to historical reasons. Consequently, what is at play in the circulation of authors and works from one place to another always pays tribute to the complexity involved in the production and the reception of meanings in different places. As a scholar who lives and works in Brazil, I'm aware of the place from which my comparisons emerge. In 2023, I was invited by the Brazilian Comparative Literature Association to talk about how comparative literature should respond to the emergence of new transnational communities. It was not an unexpected event because so many colleagues from different universities and countries have also spoken on this subject at conferences of the American Comparative Literature Association and the International Comparative Literature Association. The first thing to be said here is that there is a transnational community constructed in the realm of comparative literature, although the terms of the content of this construction are permanently in discussion. It's thus no surprise that so many colleagues from different universities and countries have also spoken on this subject at conferences of the American Comparative Literature Association and the International Comparative Literature Association. Also the Société Française de Littérature Générale et Comparée, of course. Slide 31. My basic argument is that one of the fundamental things at stake in comparatives is a problematic relationship with nationalism and internationalism, cosmopolitanism, globalization, mondialization, etc. Slide 32. This is, of course, nothing new, since Ferdinand Brunetière, one of the great comparatists of the past, when giving an overall evaluation of 19th century European literature in an article published in 1899, was already drawing attention to this problematic relationship. I believe, however, that today we need to better define what nationalism and what internationalism we are talking about here. Slide 33. Regarding nationalism, either in Europe or in the Americas, it is fair to say that literary studies from the 19th century onwards used the criterion of national to give legitimacy to works and writers, as well as to include literature as content to be passed on via the educational apparatus of Western nation states. In many cases, literature was part of the construction of an imagined national community. It is no surprise, therefore, that in the Americas, critics demanded the presence of local color in works published chiefly after independence from European colonial powers. The supposed representation of national reality became a basic criterion of the value or lack of value of publications. But what national meant was a question that was rarely asked. Slide 34. However, from the 19th century onwards, at least two divergent visions about the meaning of national coexisted. On the one hand, there was the nationalism of citizenship, which presumes that the nation is a collection of citizens united around a coexistence built on democratically approved rules. On the other hand, there was a nationalism of inherited identity that believes that nationality is acquired at birth independently of each individual's will. Those who adopt the concept of nationalism as citizenship believe that the nation is a collection of citizens that choose politically to remain together, despite possible racial, linguistic, and religious differences, under a government legitimized by their own choice. This presupposes, as is understood, an entire backdrop of enlightened ideas. And it's no surprise that the most emblematic text produced within this context in the 19th century is What is a Nation? Qu'est-ce qu'une nation? By Ernest Renan, published in 1882. On the other hand, those who adopt the concept of nationalism as an inherited identity believe that nationality is an inheritance you receive on being born in a given land, belonging to a given race, and speaking a given language. Consequently, it is believed that, independent of the will of the individual, he or she acquires at birth the spirit or the soul of the people they belong to. Geist, né? In German. Folkgeist. The name often associated with this 19th century point of view is that of Johann Gottfried Herder. It was not the nationalism of citizenship that predominated in Brazil and in other Latin American countries from the 19th century onwards, nor could it have been in the Brazilian case, since the country was a slavocracy. And like other slave-owning countries, even after abolition, it created or maintained a system of norms of social exclusion, the consequences of which can still be seen to this day. To some extent, when we try to talk about the international circulation of works and authors, we are implicitly talking about circulation between nation states. But we do not always realize that this implicit element entails a certain basis of knowledge that is already there, paying tribute at the same time to a national way of perceiving the international and to various conflicts and interests at play in the field of relations between nations. Ferdinand Baudetière, in the late 800s, believed that nationalism was one of the sides of a coin, the other side of which was cosmopolitanism. Perhaps it was not clear to him that both sides of the coin were connected to European colonialism in the 19th century, which brought the other and the different into the daily life of that continent. Even so, his observation about that century seems applicable to our current one. And I quote Ferdinand Brunetière. If we considered culture in general, this mutual penetration of nationalities will appear active, continuous, and irresistible. End of quote. As a consequence of this penetration, on the one hand, there was thought to be greater awareness of exchanges, transfers, and national literary and cultural circulation. But on the other hand, there was also a certain fear of losing a supposed national identity. Brunetière, therefore, stated that the need to delineate national literatures was the result, in his view, of this fear. Slide 35, por favor. In the post-colonial era, the legitimation of literary studies in South America also depended on the idea that national literatures contained elements of a presumed national spirit, manifested in texts in which given representations of territories, peoples, ways of life, landscapes, fauna, and flora were said to be found. Discussions about which representations would or would not be acceptable took place with varying degrees of intensity from at least the 19th century onwards, when the idea of local color spread. Slide 36, por favor. In Brazil, after independence, a literary movement chose the Indian as its national representative. Nothing better for literary Indianism than a hero who could be represented as a legitimate native of Brazil, one who has always lived here and who fought heroically against foreign colonizers. Nothing better for a nationalist literary movement than a hero who can be presented as an original product of his own land. The problem is that 19th century Brazilian writers themselves had also a European-based literary background, and this ended up generating characters such as the Guarani Amerindian Peri in the novel O Guarani, 1857, by José de Alencar, harshly criticized in the Cannibalist Manifesto, 1928, by Oswald de Andrade. I quote him: The Indian dressed as a senator of the empire, impersonating Pitt, or appearing in Alencar's operas full of good Portuguese feelings. End of quote. It is not at all surprising that this role of the indigenous character as national representative would face resistance. 1 year after publication of O Guarani, Machado de Assis published O Passado, o Presente e o Futuro da Literatura, The Past, the Present, and the Future of Literature, condemning Acadian authors for not featuring local color. And when discussing Basílio da Gama's epic poem Uruguay, expressed the following opinion. The opinion is Machado's opinion. Okay. Without following the same path as others, Gama wrote a poem, if not purely the national, at least not at all European. It was not national because it was indigenous. In barbarian indigenous poetry, the poetry of the Boré and Tupã is not national poetry. What do we have to do with that race, with those primitive inhabitants of the country, if their customs are not the characteristic face of our society? End of quote. Slide 38, por favor. In the 20th century, other meanings were attributed to Amerindians. Among the new meanings, I highlight one because it stands in sharp contrast to 19th century's representation of the Brazilian indigenous as a kind of national hero, the representation of the Amerindian as the other, the internal foreigner. This was the result of a construction in which prestigious intellectuals took part. Sérgio Buarque de Holanda, for instance, created an image of Brazil as being an implant of European culture in hostile territory, a kind of extension of European borders into a new world in which there would be resistance and problems for transplanted Europeans. In a chapter symptomatically titled European Frontiers in his book Roots of Brazil, 1936, Holanda uses the pronoun we repeatedly to designate the belonging to an Iberian and European tradition, not only of the author, but also of his potential reader, as if he believed that this reader would read the book and identify with the author's position. For him, we remain exiles in our own land, these are his words, because of the difficulties encountered in the new territory. This opinion collides head-on with what Amerindians think, who have long been pointing out the violence of the European invasion in Abya Yala. That's how the Amerindians named what we name as Americas, and emphasizing that the implanted European culture was hostile to the autochthonous tradition. For example, Ailton Krenak, Davi Copenal, there are many. Slide 39, por favor. However, Holanda argues in favor of the predominance of European tradition over that of original populations. That is, the predominance of us, Europeans or European descendants, in relation to foreign races, his expression. And I quote here Sérgio Buarque de Holanda and Roots of Brazil. Experience and tradition teach us that all cultures generally absorb, assimilate, and develop the traits of other cultures only when they fit them in their own frameworks of life. In this sense, we should remember what happened to European cultures transplanted to the New World. Neither contact nor mixture with foreign races has made us different from our grandfathers from overseas. He means the Portuguese, as at some times we would like to be. In the Brazilian case, no matter how unattractive it may seem to some of our compatriots, in truth, we're still associated with the Iberian Peninsula, especially Portugal, through a long and active tradition, active enough even today to nourish our common soul despite all that separates us. We can say that the present form of our culture comes from there, sorry. All other elements were adapted as best as they could to that culture. End of quote. If Sérgio Buarque de Holanda believes that we received our heritage through an Iberian nation, he also realizes that the Iberian Peninsula itself was not a stagnant place, since, as Vail Hassan pointed out, in addition to the several centuries of Arab occupation, which left many other roots, the Iberian countries were active points of communication between Europe and other territories. Slide 40, por favor. I quote Sérgio Buarque de Holanda. First and significantly, we received our inheritance through an Iberian nation. Spain and Portugal, along with Russia and the Balkan countries, and to a certain extent England as well, are bridge territories through which Europe communicates with other worlds. They make up a frontier and transition zone, somewhat less laden with the Europeanism that is nevertheless an essential part of their heritage. End of quote. The impasse between Eurocentric and autochthonous points of view, when the question is posed in terms of contrasts and confrontations, somehow contaminated the debate, leading many to think that there would be no alternative to mutually exclusive points of view. However, even among some of the most discussed Amerindian works in contemporary times, such as the books by Rigoberta Menchú, Rigoberta Menchú, An Indian Woman in Guatemala, and Davi Kopenawa, The Falling Sky, Words of an Yanomami Shaman, there is a clear demonstration that it is necessary to build bridges and nuances between these 2 points of view to better understand what happens today. Slide 41, por favor. If we compare the Falling Sky work of an Yanomami shaman with Rigoberta Menchú, An Indian Woman in Guatemala, we can verify that the 2 narratives, although originating in different nation states, Brazil and Guatemala, have some common characteristics. They are aimed at a non-indigenous audience. They describe elements of Amerindian culture. They present historical facts regarding the encounter between Amerindian culture and the broader culture in their respective countries, but from an indigenous perspective. They were originally published in languages other than those of their Amerindian authors. They are organized and structured by non-Amerindian members of the comprehensive culture linked to anthropology or ethnology. An international comparison between those 2 works cannot fail to take into account that the nation states in which they originate do not necessarily imply for their authors belonging. In fact, in both narratives, Menchú and Kopenawa denounce a clash between nationally constituted powers and the Amerindian ethnicities to which each one of them belongs. If the processes of domination at the national and international level are somehow derived from a Western logic that underlies the existing nation-state type formations and the relationship between nation-states, it is necessary to understand that if we use this logic exclusively, it will be difficult to understand what cannot be captured by it. In South America, the forces that acted at different levels in favor of national homogeneity also did internal work to undermine differences. Slide 42, por favor. In the case of original populations, the feeling of belonging to common territories, ethnicities, languages, and cultures in post-colonial nation states was harmed for several reasons. The partition of former Amerindian territories based on non-indigenous logic, the submission of the various ethnicities to different laws within different national states, the levels of differentiation that will be established when these ethnicities are forced to deal with different languages and broad cultures. However, what the two narratives show us in Guatemala and Brazil is that there is no possibility of return to a situation prior to contact with the West. Therefore, it is fundamental for the survival of the original peoples that Westerners understand their other logics, constituted of the ways of life of those peoples. Copenaua, like Menchu, points to the violence historically perpetrated against original peoples by Westerners. But the Yanomami, shaman, Copenaua, has a clear notion that there is no possibility of a return to the moment before the invasion of Abya Yala and the imposition of a foreign logic on indigenous populations. As the very survival of the Yanomami depends on the relationship with the whites, Copenaua argues. Slide 43, por favor. I would like white people to stop thinking that our forest is dead and placed here without reason. I would like to make them listen to the voice of the Shapiri. Shapiri are kinds of spirits of the forest. I would like to make them listen to the voice of the Shapiri, who play here incessantly, dancing on the glittering mirrors. Maybe they will want to defend it with us. I would also like their sons and daughters to understand our words. I would like them to make friendship with our sons and daughters in order not to grow up in ignorance. If this forest is entirely devastated, no other forest will ever be born. End of quote. If in other parts of the world, literary scholars have long pointed out the need for comparativism to operate beyond the logic of the nation state, which underlies nationalisms and internationalisms, this need is burning in South America. Although we already have a tradition that operates beyond this logic, as demonstrated by the works of Ana Pizarro, Ángel Rama, Davi Copenaua, Ailton Krenak, Eduardo Coutinho, João César de Castro Rocha, and Fábio Almeida de Carvalho, among others, there's still much to be done. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muito obrigada, Jobim, por essa apresentação muito cheia de referências, muito cheia de leituras e de indicações de pistas. Vamos deixar aberto agora para ver se as pessoas têm algumas perguntas.
You're speaking Portuguese.
Hã?
You're speaking Portuguese.
É o costume. Okay, am I supposed to do question in English too?
Well, you can do it in French. Both the students do, as the way, but Portuguese is not the best option, probably.
You're right. Ok. Est-ce que vous avez des questions à poser peut-être ou des commentaires à faire? Ne soyez pas timide. Vous n'êtes pas obligé de venir devant l'ordinateur, mais vous pouvez toujours faire une réflexion.
I would like to add one thing that I forgot, which was the last slide. Please, could you please show it Roberto. That's not the last one. There's still another one. No, the last one. That's it. I would like to tell you that in a couple of weeks, you can have the whole thing, my text in this book that's going to be published in like 2 weeks. A book organized, edited by Chloé Chaudet, myself, and Jean-Marc Murat, Question comparatiste vue du Sud. And it's in French, so it's going to be easier for the students. Okay? Thank you, Roberto.
Super, très bien. Encore une référence. Donc, je disais, est-ce que quelqu'un veut peut-être faire un commentaire, poser une question? Ne soyez pas timide, profitez-en. Il a abordé ici plusieurs thématiques quand même sur la question de la comparaison, et pas seulement, donc il y a Brésil, mais aussi voilà, Amérique latine. Je pense que c'est intéressant, ça peut vous intéresser vous, et certainement vous avez eu des échos avec ce que vous travaillez aussi en salle de cours dans le cadre du Master des Amériques. Non, pas de commentaire. Némora. Tu veux venir ou tu veux la faire d'ici? Oui.
I'm sorry, I can't hear her.
Non,
je sais. Attends, je vais dire.
Amérindiens qui font justement ce fond de comparatisme entre leur culture et la culture nationale.
D'accord. Donc, ok. Donc, on a une étudiante ici, Némora, qui demande si tu as cité Rigoberta Menchú et tu as cité aussi Copenhague. Et donc, elle demande s'il y a d'autres auteurs qui font également ce travail finalement de comparaison comparatiste entre ces cultures amérindiennes, outre l'Uruguay et le Brésil.
Is it a question about bibliography? Because, of course, there is an amazing amount of bibliography that can be quoted here, and my memory is not as good as it should be. But I can tell you that this bibliography is very much relevant, either in Portuguese or in Spanish, if we're talking about South America. But there are, of course, other books in Caribbean and in North America too that are important.
Okay, thank you. D'autres questions? Il a répondu à ta question? Oui. Oui. Mm-hmm. Donc, elle demande s'il y a eu un impact national ou en Europe de la production de Copenhague avec Bruxelles-Berg, justement, sur l'œuvre La chute du ciel. Quel impact, quelle réception, quel impact il y a pu avoir au Brésil?
This is an interesting question because, as a matter of fact, the book by Copenhague was first published in Europe, in France, to be more exact. And I would like to say that this is a very good example of how this kind of book is a kind of a joint venture, if we could use this expression, meaning that it is written by two people, and it couldn't have been written if there was not such a combined way of working, because of course Schopenhauer is not able to write a book. The idea of book does not belong to his own culture, the Yanomami culture. He even uses, when he wants to characterize the act of writing, he uses the idea of painting in a piece of wood. So, because of course, as we know, paper is made of wood, and the book in itself, it was made from a lot of interviews made along many years by Bruce Albert, who is a French anthropologist. Not exactly French, because he was not born in France, but he lived his whole life and he worked in France his whole life. So I can say he is a French anthropologist, and this would be true, I think. And so he was responsible first for the translation, because of course, if the text was in Yanomami, it wouldn't be accessible for anybody but the Yanomami people. So he wrote the original version in French. Although the Yanomami, they live, in the case of Schopenhauer, he lives in Brazilian territory. The first edition of the Falling Skies is the French edition, and the translation and the organization of the text, the division in chapters and everything else, this is a work of Bruce Albert. So let's say this is an intercultural book, and I think this is very well configured in the foreword of the book, because without those two working together, it wouldn't have been published at all. And it's also interesting because if the Amerindians, and we are talking here not only of Schopenhauer but Rigoberta Menchú, if they wanted, and they did really want to do this, if they wanted to be understood, if they wanted to have a dialogue with the overarching society, to go beyond their own culture, beyond their own tribe, in order to survive. So this would mean also the introduction of another language, a language different from their own peoples, and also an introduction of a kind of transcultural agent such as Bruce Albert or Elisabeth Burgos, who would be able to communicate with their own white societies in a way that these societies would understand what the Amerindians had to say. So I think this kind of text represented by those two books that I have mentioned is very interesting when we talk about transculturación, and we talk about the cultural transfers and cultural circulation.
Okay, I'm gonna do a question in English. you were talking about translation, and in the circulation, you gave examples of circulations of works, and in the circulation, you say that meanings change, right? But that means that change instead of trying to significate something. Can we talk about comparatism, or is it translation? I mean, what is the difference between translation and comparatism in this case when meanings change? You understand my question?
Well, I think when we talk about translation, we always talk about transformation.
Yeah.
Translation is transformation. I could give you lots of examples. I will just choose a few of these examples. First of all, just to give examples of some aspects of translation as a question of literary and cultural circulation. For instance, in the beginning of this class, I have mentioned a review I made of the David Damrosch's book that was published in China. So this article was published in English, and I would say, okay, so you sent them the Portuguese version and they translated. No, it doesn't work like this, because this journal, they always ask us to write in English, not because they don't have Portuguese translators there, but because the people who work in this scientific journal, they wouldn't be able to see if the translation was good or not. So, in a way, when we talk about the scientific circulation, and we're talking about our field, because I'm talking about specifically an article written in English in a journal that publishes articles about literature and culture. And so this is the first thing. Now, what is the politics, the international politics about translation concerning the language from which or towards which we are making the translations? That's one aspect. The second aspect is that, of course, there are always aspects of any text, literary or not, that cannot be, let's say, translated. And there is this English expression, lost in translation. What is it that's lost in translation? But, of course, you live in France, you remember that Barbara Cassin, elle a édité she edited a book whose title was Dictionnaire des intraductibles, or something like this. And this was translated into English. So we would have to think twice about the idea that it is impossible anyway to translate from one language to another one. The question is, what is it that you are doing when you're saying that you're transposing one meaning from one language to another? Because, of course, there's always something happening there. And the Haroldo and Augusto de Campos, the brothers Campos here in Brazil, who were known even internationally for their translation work, they used, instead of translation, they preferred to use the word transcriação, transcreation, because they said, well, translation always involves some work of translation, of creation. Translation always involves some work of creation. So there are many aspects related to this. And of course, the translator is a very important figure for any literature, because he is the main agent for any literature to be known outside its own borders. Because, of course, if, for instance, if Schopenhauer had his book published in Yanomami, so it would be, his book would be limited, the circulation of his book, the circulation, not only the circulation, but the possible reading of his book would be limited to his own community. But after it was translated into French, it started circulating first for a public that spoke French. Then from French, it was translated into English. From French, it was translated into Portuguese, as meaning this is a very interesting example, because he lives here in Brazil, but his book was translated into Portuguese. So there are many aspects that I could go on talking, but I will stop here, because we have certainly other questions or other subjects.
Can you just repeat who talked about the transcreation? Because we have here online Maya Neto, that is reacting to this transgression. No way, she said. So
Haroldo de Campos, Augusto de Campos, the brothers Campos.
Okay. Thanks, Jobim. Ok. Pas d'autres questions? Non? Donc, je pense qu'on va s'arrêter par ici, s'il n'y a pas d'autres questions. Jobim, on te remercie encore une fois pour ta présence, pour ta présentation excellente, pour toutes ces références que tu nous as données. Beaucoup de choses à discuter à partir de ça. Et encore merci d'avoir été là pour ce cours international, pour la 3e édition déjà. Et congrats for your next book. Je ne savais pas que tu avais encore un livre à paraître. C'est super. Voilà.
C'est un livre à paraître et je vous invite à le lire.
Bien sûr, avec plaisir. Merci beaucoup, Jobim. À très bientôt.
Merci.
Merci.